rejected Omega was found, sleeping in the barn. With the Alpha Kings expecting Wolf, what did he do? The scream came first, then the silence. Elias hit the ground hard, his shoulder cracking against the frozen dirt of the courtyard, and every wolf in the settlement turned to watch him fall. He did not cry out. He had learned long ago that crying out only made them laugh harder. Above him stood Dorian, the beta of the Ashwood pack, his lips curled back over sharp teeth, his eyes glinting with a satisfaction that made Elias's stomach turn. Around them, in a loose and hungry circle, stood the rest of the pack. Some watched with pity. Most watched with nothing at all. "You are nothing," Dorian said, his voice carrying across the yard, so that even the pups peering from doorways could hear it. "An Omega who cannot keep a mate, who brings shame to every den he enters. We are done pretending you belong here." Elias pushed himself up onto his knees, ignoring the throbbing pain in his shoulder. His voice, when it came, was steady, even though his hands were not. "I did nothing wrong. You know I did nothing wrong." "What I know," Dorian said, stepping closer, "is that the pack has spoken. You are rejected. Take your things, if you still have any worth taking, and leave before nightfall." A murmur ran through the crowd, but no one moved to stop it. No one moved to defend him. Not even Nadia, who had once called him a friend, who had once sat beside him at the fire and laughed at his jokes. She stood at the edge of the circle now, with her eyes down, her arms wrapped around herself, saying nothing. Elias understood, in that moment, exactly how alone he was. He rose to his feet slowly, brushing the dirt from his knees, and looked around at the faces that had once felt like family. There was no use arguing. A rejection, once spoken by a beta in front of the pack, could not be undone. The words carried a weight older than any of them, a weight woven into the blood of every wolf who had ever lived under the moon. Once spoken, they became truth, whether they were true or not. "Fine," he said quietly. "I'll go." He did not look back as he walked to the small cabin at the edge of the settlement that had been his home for the last 3 years. He did not look back as he gathered the little he owned into a worn leather bag. He did not look back as he passed through the gate and out into the frozen forest beyond, the cold air biting at his face, the last rays of daylight slipping behind the mountains. It was only when the settlement disappeared behind the trees that he allowed himself to stop, to lean against the trunk of an old pine, and let the tears finally come. He did not know how long he cried, long enough that his fingers had gone numb, long enough that the sky above had turned from gray to black, scattered with cold stars that offered no warmth at all. When he finally forced himself to move again, his legs felt like they belonged to someone else. Elias had grown up hearing stories about Omegas who were cast out. He had always believed, foolishly, that it would never happen to him. He had done everything right. He had followed every rule, respected every elder, given everything he had to a pack that had, in the end, decided he was worth nothing at all. The truth, the one that burned hotter than the humiliation, was that he had been framed. He knew it. He had suspected for weeks that something was wrong within the pack, that goods were moving through the borders that should not have been moving, that Omegas from neighboring packs were disappearing, and no one was asking why. He had asked too many questions. He had looked in the wrong places. And so, when accusations of theft and betrayal were suddenly leveled against him, accusations built from lies, stitched together so carefully that even he had struggled to find the seams, no one had questioned them. It was easier to believe a convenient lie than to look at an uncomfortable truth. Now he walked alone through unfamiliar woods, with no pack, no protection, and no idea where the borders of his former territory ended and the territory of strangers began. In Wolflands, an unclaimed Omega walking without escort was either extremely brave or extremely foolish. Elias suspected he was both. The night grew colder as he walked. He had no map, no clear direction, only the vague hope that if he kept moving south he might reach one of the smaller, kinder packs he had heard about in old stories, a place that might take in a stranger without asking too many questions. But stories were not maps, and hope was not a fire, and by the time the moon had risen fully into the sky, Elias was shivering so hard his teeth ached. He caught the smell of wood smoke on the wind, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere to the east. Whether it meant safety or danger, he did not know. But cold was a simpler enemy than fear, and so he turned toward it, stumbling over roots and stones in the darkness. following the scent like a lifeline. What he did not know, could not know, was that he had crossed an invisible line sometime in the last hour, a line that marked the edge of one of the most powerful and most feared territories in the northern wilds. He did not know that the wood smoke came from the great stone house of Cade, the alpha king of the Frost Pack, a leader whose name alone was enough to silence a room. He did not know that the fields and forests he now walked through belonged to a king who did not tolerate strangers, especially not strangers who arrived uninvited and unannounced in the dead of night. All Elias knew was that his body was failing him, that his legs could barely carry him another mile, and that somewhere ahead there was warmth, and warmth was the only thing that mattered anymore. He walked until the trees thinned and gave way to open fields, silver under the moonlight, and there, rising out of the mist, he saw it. A barn, old and weathered, its wooden boards silvered with age, standing at the edge of a much grander estate, whose lights glowed faintly in the distance. It was not the great stone house itself, but close enough that Elias felt a fresh wave of fear settle over him. He was trespassing, he knew that much, but his body had stopped listening to reason hours ago. He crept toward the barn, moving as quietly as his exhausted limbs would allow, and slipped through a gap where one of the old doors had warped away from its frame. Inside, the air was still, thick with the smell of hay and old wood, and blessedly warmer than the night outside. He found a corner near a stack of hay bales and sank down into it, pulling his thin coat tighter around himself. He told himself he would rest only for a moment, only long enough to catch his breath and warm his hands, and then he would move on before anyone discovered him. But exhaustion has its own plans, and within minutes, Elias's eyes had slipped closed, and his breathing had slowed into the steady rhythm of deep, dreamless sleep. He did not hear the soft rustle of straw nearby. He did not notice the shape that shifted closer to him in the darkness, drawn by the simple, animal comfort of shared warmth. He did not know that only a few feet away, curled in her own nest of blankets and hay, lay Rhea, the Luna of the Frost Pack, heavy with pups and unable to find rest in the grand house, where every creak of the floor and every whisper of wind through the windows kept her awake. Rhea had come to the barn hours earlier, seeking the same simple comfort Elias now sought, the quiet stillness of a place untouched by the pressures of a great house and a watchful staff. She had fallen asleep herself, curled against the warm flank of an old barn cat that had long since wandered off, leaving her wrapped only in blankets that had grown thin against the night chill. When the stranger's warmth reached her in her sleep, some deep and ancient instinct in her, some part of her that had nothing to do with rank or politics or the careful rules of pack life, simply welcomed it. She shifted closer without waking, drawn like any creature is drawn toward warmth in the cold. And Elias, deep in his own exhausted sleep, shifted closer too, his body responding to comfort without his mind ever knowing. By the time the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the gaps in the barn's old walls, the two of them lay close together in the hay, breathing slow and even, utterly unaware of what the coming morning would bring. Neither of them heard the heavy footsteps approaching across the frozen field outside. Neither of them heard the barn door creak open, and neither of them was awake to see the look that crossed the face of the Alpha King as he stepped inside and found his pregnant mate, sleeping beside a stranger he had never seen before in his life. The morning had begun in fury, before either of them had even opened their eyes. Cade had not meant to visit the old barn that morning. He had woken before dawn, restless as he had been for weeks, and had walked the grounds simply to clear his head, before the day's demands began pressing in on him. The pack had grown tense in recent months. Rumors of unrest along the southern border had reached his ears more than once. Whispers of a rival pack testing weak points in his territory, watching and waiting for any sign of vulnerability. And there was no greater vulnerability for an alpha king than an expecting mate. Rhea's pregnancy had changed everything. It had softened him in ways he had never expected, and hardened him in ways he had never known were possible. He found himself checking on her constantly, unable to shake the fear that something might happen to her, or to the pups she carried, pups who would one day inherit everything he had built. It was this same restless worry that had drawn him toward the barn that morning, remembering that she often wandered there when sleep would not come to her in the great house. He pushed open the heavy door, expecting to find her alone, perhaps curled beside the old barn cat she had grown fond of, perhaps simply staring up at the rafters lost in thought. What he found instead stopped him cold. There, in the pale morning light filtering through the gaps in the wooden walls, lay his mate, curled peacefully in the hay, and pressed close beside her, an arm resting near her middle, was a stranger. A man Cade had never seen in his life, his clothes worn and dirty, his face pale with exhaustion even in sleep. For one long, terrible moment, Cade could not move. His mind refused to process what his eyes were showing him. Then instinct took over where reason failed, and a growl tore up from somewhere deep in his chest, a sound so low and so dangerous that it seemed to shake the very boards of the barn. Elias woke first, his body responding to the sound of danger, before his mind had even caught up. His eyes snapped open, and he found himself staring up into the face of a man whose eyes had gone gold with rage, whose entire frame seemed to have grown larger with fury, whose hand was already closing around the collar of his coat. "Who are you?" Cade said, and the words came out low and terrible, each one carrying the weight of a threat. "What are you doing here? What have you done?" Elias tried to speak, but his throat had closed with fear, and all that came out was a strangled gasp as Cade hauled him up off the ground with a strength that made his feet leave the floor entirely. Beside them, Rhea stirred, blinking awake into the chaos, her eyes widening as she took in the scene before her. Her mate, towering with fury, holding a stranger by the collar, as though he meant to end his life on the spot. "Cade, wait," she said, her voice still thick with sleep, but sharpening quickly with alarm. "Wait, please. Put him down." "He was beside you," Cade said, not taking his eyes off Elias, whose face had gone pale with terror. "In your sleep, touching you. Tell me why I should not tear him apart where he stands." "Because I do not know if I would have made it through the night without him," Rhea said, pushing herself upright with some difficulty, one hand pressed to the curve of her belly. "The cold last night was terrible. I could not find warmth anywhere. I do not even remember him arriving. I only remember waking up warmer than I had been in hours." Cade's grip did not loosen, but something in his eyes flickered, a crack of doubt breaking through the wall of rage. "You are certain he did nothing?" "I am certain," Rhea said firmly, though her eyes moved to Elias with a curiosity that had nothing to do with anger. "Look at him, Cade. Look at how thin he is, how exhausted. This is not a man who came here to cause harm. This is a man who came here because he had nowhere else to go." For a long moment, no one spoke. Elias hung there, still gripped by the collar, his feet barely touching the ground, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He had faced rejection and humiliation the day before, but nothing had prepared him for the raw fear of standing before an alpha king who believed him a threat to his mate and unborn pups. "Please," Elias managed finally, his voice cracking. "I meant no harm. I was cold. I did not know this was your land. I did not know she was here. I swear it on my own life." Cade studied him for a long moment, his golden eyes narrowing, searching Elias's face for any sign of deception. Whatever he found there, or did not find, seemed to ease the fury in his grip, if only slightly. He set Elias back down onto his feet, though he did not release his collar entirely. "Explain yourself," Cade said, "now. And know that if I hear even a hint of a lie, you will regret ever setting foot on this land." Elias swallowed hard, his mind racing to find the right words that would explain his presence without inviting further trouble. "My name is Elias. I was rejected from my pack yesterday. Cast out with nothing, no protection, no home. I walked through the night trying to find shelter, and I saw this barn and thought it was empty. I did not know it belonged to you. I did not know she was here. I only wanted to rest until I could gather my strength to keep moving." Rhea, still seated in the hay, watched the exchange with sharp attention, her earlier drowsiness gone entirely now. There was something in the way Elias spoke, something raw and honest in the tremble of his voice, that struck her as different from the usual excuses she had heard from wandering strangers over the years. "Rejected," Cade repeated, the word rolling off his tongue with clear distaste. Rejection was not something taken lightly among wolves. It meant something had gone deeply wrong, either with the Omega himself, or with the pack that had cast him out. For what reason? "Theft," Elias said quietly, shame coloring his cheeks, even though he knew, deep down, that he had done nothing wrong. "Betrayal, accusations I could not disprove, though I swear before you and the moon above that they were false." Cade's eyes flicked briefly toward Rhea, some silent communication passing between them that Elias could not read. Then the Alpha King stepped back, releasing his collar entirely, though his expression remained hard. "I do not trust wandering strangers," Cade said. "Especially not ones found sleeping beside my mate, but she says you did her no harm, and my mate's word carries great weight in this pack, even against my own instincts." "Thank you," Elias breathed, relief flooding through him so suddenly that his knees nearly buckled. "Do not thank me yet," Cade said sharply. "You will not be leaving this estate. Not until I understand exactly who you are, and why fate saw fit to drop you into my barn, on the very night my mate slept there alone. You will remain here under guard, watched at all times, until I decide what is to be done with you." Elias opened his mouth to protest, some instinct telling him that staying under guard, even gentle guard, was still a kind of cage, but one look at the hard set of Cade's jaw told him that arguing would accomplish nothing. "As you wish," he said instead, bowing his head slightly, and something about the gesture, humble and without resentment, seemed to ease a fraction more of the tension in the barn. Rhea, watching quietly from her seat in the hay, felt something stir in her chest that she could not quite name. Sympathy, perhaps, or curiosity, or something else entirely that she was not yet ready to examine too closely. She had seen many things in her years as Luna of the Frost Pack, had met many strangers who passed through their lands seeking shelter or opportunity. But there was something about this one, something in the exhaustion behind his eyes, and the quiet dignity in the way he accepted his fate, that told her this encounter would not be as simple as Cade wanted it to be. Outside, the morning sun continued its slow climb over the frozen fields, indifferent to the tension unfolding within the old barn's walls. Somewhere beyond the estate's borders, in lands to the south, a pack that had cast out one of its own, was already beginning to realize that the Omega they had discarded had not simply vanished into the wilderness as they had assumed. And somewhere even further south, men who had built a quiet and profitable trade on the suffering of Omegas like Elias were beginning to wonder if the questions he had asked before his exile might yet come back to threaten everything they had built. None of them, not Cade, not Rhea, and certainly not Elias, could have known that morning just how deeply their fates had already become entangled, or how far the consequences of that single, accidental night in the barn would eventually reach. The guard assigned to watch Elias was a broad-shouldered wolf named Callum, a man of few words and fewer smiles, who made it clear from the first hour that he considered his new duty beneath him. He stood by the door of the small guest room where Elias had been placed, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, as though expecting the exhausted stranger to leap up and cause trouble at any moment. Elias did not blame him for the suspicion. He understood, better than most, how quickly trust could be withdrawn, and how slowly it could be rebuilt, if it could be rebuilt at all. He sat quietly on the edge of the narrow bed he had been given, staring at his hands, replaying the morning's events over and over in his mind. He had come so close to losing his life in that barn. The memory of Cade's grip on his collar, the golden fury in his eyes, still made his pulse quicken every time he thought of it. He had not expected kindness from an Alpha King. He had not expected to be spared at all, and yet here he was, fed a simple meal of bread and broth, given a room with a bed, however closely watched he might be. It was more than he had received from his own pack in the final days before his rejection. The days that followed settled into a strange and careful rhythm. Elias was given small chores around the estate, tasks meant to test his usefulness as much as to occupy his time. He mended fences along the eastern pasture. He helped carry water from the well to the kitchens. He cleared brush from paths that had grown overgrown during the harsher months of winter. Wherever he went, Callum or another guard followed at a careful distance, watching, always watching. It was during one of these chores, mending a broken section of fence near the edge of the eastern pasture, that Rhea found him again for the first time since the barn. She approached slowly, one hand resting on the curve of her belly as she walked, her steps careful on the uneven ground. Elias noticed her before she spoke, and immediately set down his tools, bowing his head respectfully. "You do not need to bow to me every time I appear," Rhea said, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "It is exhausting to watch, and I imagine it is exhausting to do." Elias straightened slightly, though he kept his eyes lowered out of habit. "I would not want to give offense, Luna. I am aware of how precarious my position here remains." "Precarious," Rhea repeated, tilting her head slightly as she studied him. "That is an interesting word for a man who saved me from freezing in a barn." I did not intend to save anyone, Elias admitted honestly. I was simply cold myself, and too exhausted to notice I was not alone. Rhea laughed softly at that, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise even her. At least you are honest. Most men in your position would try to claim more credit than they deserve. Honesty has not served me particularly well in recent days, Elias said, a note of quiet bitterness creeping into his voice before he could stop it. He caught himself immediately and looked away, embarrassed. Forgive me. That was not meant for your ears. No, do not apologize, Rhea said, lowering herself carefully onto a nearby stump, one hand still resting protectively over her belly. I would like to hear it, if you are willing to share. Cade told me a little of what you said in the barn, about being rejected, about the accusations against you, but I would like to hear it from you directly, if you do not mind. Elias hesitated, glancing toward Callum, who stood a short distance away, clearly listening despite his attempt to appear disinterested. But Rhea's expression was patient and genuinely curious, without a trace of the suspicion Cade had shown, and something in her open manner made him want to trust her, however cautious he tried to remain. I served my pack faithfully for years, he began slowly. I never sought power or position, only to do my part and live quietly. But some months ago, I began noticing strange things. Omegas from smaller packs nearby, disappearing, without explanation. Goods moving through our borders, that no one seemed willing to discuss openly. I asked questions. Perhaps too many questions. Rhea's expression sharpened with interest. What kind of questions? I wanted to know where the Omegas were going, Elias said. I wanted to know why certain wagons left our territory under cover of darkness and returned empty. I brought my concerns to the Beta, thinking he would want to investigate such things as much as I did. Instead, within weeks, I found myself accused of theft, of betraying pack secrets to outsiders. The accusations were built so carefully that I could not disprove them, though I knew every word was false. You believe someone silenced you, Rhea said quietly, understanding dawning in her eyes. I believe I saw something I was not meant to see, Elias said. And rather than risk me uncovering more, it was simpler to discredit me entirely, and cast me out where no one would believe a word I said. Rhea was quiet for a long moment, her hand moving in slow, absent circles over her belly as she considered his words. That is a serious accusation to make against your own pack. I know, Elias said, and I have no proof, only my own memory of what I saw and what I asked. I do not expect you to believe me. I barely expect anyone to believe me anymore. I believe you, Rhea said simply, and the quiet certainty in her voice caught Elias entirely off guard. Perhaps it is foolish of me. Perhaps Cade would tell me I am too trusting of strangers who wander onto our land. But I have learned to trust my instincts over the years, and my instincts tell me you are not lying. Elias felt something loosen in his chest, some tight knot of tension he had been carrying since the moment of his rejection, easing slightly for the first time in days. Thank you, he said quietly. You do not know what it means to hear that from someone. I imagine I have some idea, Rhea said, a shadow of old memory passing briefly across her face before she pushed it away. But that is a story for another time, perhaps. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Cade himself, striding across the pasture with the purposeful gait of a man who had many demands on his time and little patience for delay. His eyes flicked between Rhea and Elias with a wariness that had not entirely faded since the morning in the barn, though it seemed, perhaps, a fraction less sharp than before. Rhea, he said, you should not be wandering the grounds alone in your condition. I am hardly alone, Rhea said dryly, gesturing toward Callum, who straightened immediately under his king's gaze. And Elias is hardly dangerous, Cade. You would know that if you spent even a few minutes speaking with him instead of watching him from across the courtyard. Cade's jaw tightened slightly, but he did not argue the point directly. Instead, he turned his attention fully to Elias, studying him with the same searching intensity he had shown in the barn. The Border Patrol reported unusual movement along the southern edge of our territory this morning, he said. Tracks that do not match any of our own patrols. I would like to know if you recognize the pattern of them. Elias blinked in surprise at the sudden shift in tone, at being addressed not as a suspect but as someone whose opinion might actually hold value. I would be glad to look, if it would help. Then come, Cade said simply. turning on his heel and walking back toward the main house, without waiting to see if Elias would follow. Elias glanced at Rhea, who offered him a small, encouraging nod, before hurrying after the Alpha King, Callum falling into step a careful distance behind them both. As they walked, Elias could not help but notice the subtle shift that had occurred within just a few days. He was no longer simply a prisoner confined to a single room and a handful of menial chores. He was being asked, however reluctantly, for his knowledge, his opinion, his help. It was a small thing, perhaps, but after the humiliation of his rejection, it felt like the first solid ground he had stood on in longer than he could remember. He did not yet know how significant that small shift would prove to be, or how the tracks along the southern border would soon connect to threats far greater than either he or Cade currently understood. But for the first time since his exile, Elias allowed himself the smallest flicker of hope that perhaps, in this strange and unexpected place, he might yet find something worth staying for. The tracks along the southern border told a story that made Cade's expression grow darker with every step he took along the tree line. Elias crouched beside him, examining the marks pressed into the half-frozen mud, his brow furrowed in concentration. "These are not patrol tracks," Elias said finally, running his fingers lightly along the edge of one deep print. "Too heavy, too deliberate. Whoever made these was moving slowly, careful not to leave obvious signs, but they did not expect anyone to look closely enough to notice the depth of the prints." "Meaning what?" Cade asked, watching him with an intensity that had not fully softened despite the days that had passed. "Meaning someone was scouting your border," Elias said, "testing how closely it is watched, how quickly your patrols respond. This is not the work of wandering strangers. This is reconnaissance." Cade's eyes narrowed as he studied the tracks himself, comparing what Elias had pointed out against his own knowledge of the land. "How do you know so much about reading tracks like this?" "My old pack bordered contested territory for years," Elias said. "I was trained young to recognize the difference between careless wandering and careful scouting. It seems that training has followed me, even here." For a long moment, Cade said nothing, simply studying the tracks, and then studying Elias himself, as though trying to reconcile the image of the exhausted, frightened stranger from the barn, with the composed, knowledgeable man crouched beside him now. "If you are right," Cade said slowly, "then someone is testing my borders, while my mate carries pups close to their time. That is not a coincidence I am willing to accept easily." "No," Elias agreed quietly. "It rarely is." They continued along the border for another hour, Elias pointing out subtle signs that Cade's own patrols had missed, broken branches at heights that suggested deliberate marking, faint scent trails that lingered despite attempts to mask them with crushed herbs. By the time they returned to the main house, Cade's expression had shifted from wary suspicion to something closer to grudging respect, though he was careful not to let it show too openly. That evening, as the household settled into the quiet routines of dusk, Elias found himself summoned once more, this time to a small study within the great house where Cade sat behind a heavy wooden desk, a map of the surrounding territory spread out before him. "Sit," Cade said, gesturing to a chair across from him without looking up from the map. Elias sat carefully, uncertain of what to expect. The room was warm, lit by a low fire in the hearth, and for the first time since his arrival, he felt something close to ordinary comfort settle over him. "Tell me about the pack that rejected you," Cade said, finally lifting his eyes to meet Elias's. "Names, positions, anything you can recall about their dealings, their alliances." Elias hesitated only briefly before answering, understanding that this was, perhaps, his chance to prove his worth, beyond simple gratitude for shelter. He spoke carefully, detailing the structure of the Ashwood pack, the names of its beta and elders, the strange shipments he had noticed in his final months there, the disappearances he had tried and failed to investigate. Cade listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting notes onto a separate sheet of parchment, his expression unreadable throughout most of the account. When Elias finished, the Alpha King sat back in his chair, studying him with the same searching look he had used since the very first morning in the barn. "You understand," Cade said slowly, "that if what you are telling me is true, it suggests a pack engaged in something far more dangerous than simple internal politics." "I understand," Elias said quietly. "I understood it the moment I began asking questions, though I did not fully grasp how far it might reach until I was cast out for asking them." "And you believe this, Scouting along my border might be connected. I do not know for certain, Elias admitted. But it would not surprise me. If your territory offers a route they wish to use, or if they believe you might interfere with whatever trade they are running, then testing your defenses would make sense. Especially now, while your Luna is close to her time, and your attention is understandably divided. Cade's jaw tightened at the mention of Rhea's condition, a flicker of protective anger crossing his features before he forced it back down. If that is true, then you may have done me a greater service today than you realize, simply by being able to read those tracks. I did nothing more than notice what your own patrols overlooked, Elias said modestly. That is not nothing, Cade said firmly. In my experience, most men see only what they expect to see. You saw what was actually there. That is a rare skill, and one I would be foolish to waste, simply because of how you first arrived on my land. Elias felt a flush of something unfamiliar rise in his chest, a small, cautious warmth that came from being valued rather than merely tolerated. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to him as though his opinion carried weight, that he almost did not know how to respond. Thank you, he said finally, the words feeling inadequate for the shift he sensed occurring between them. Cade studied him a moment longer, then rose from his desk, walking slowly to the window that overlooked the darkened fields beyond. I will not pretend my suspicion of you has vanished entirely, he said, his back still turned. Too many things about your arrival remain unexplained. But I am not a king who can afford to dismiss useful knowledge simply because I do not yet trust the man offering it. That seems a fair position, Elias said carefully. You will continue to be watched, Cade continued. But you will also be given more freedom to move about the estate, and I will expect you to share anything further you notice or recall that might help protect this pack. In exchange, you will be given proper quarters, proper meals, and the beginnings, however small, of a place here. Elias felt his throat tighten unexpectedly at the offer, an offer far more generous than he had any right to expect given the circumstances of his arrival. I will not disappoint you, he said quietly. See that you do not, Cade said, finally turning back to face him, his golden eyes steady and unreadable. Because if I discover that any part of what you have told me is false, the mercy my mate convinced me to show will not be extended a second time. The warning was clear, and Elias accepted it without protest, understanding fully the precariousness of the trust being extended to him. As he left the study that evening, walking back toward the guest quarters that would soon be exchanged for something more permanent, he found himself reflecting on how quickly his circumstances had shifted in just a handful of days. He had arrived at the Frostpack's border as a rejected Omega with nothing left to lose, expecting only to find brief shelter before continuing his aimless wandering. Instead, he found himself being drawn slowly, cautiously, into the very fabric of a pack he had never intended to join, bound not by blood or by bond, but by circumstance, and by the small, growing thread of usefulness he had managed to weave for himself. He did not yet know how deeply that thread would eventually tie him to the fate of the Frostpack, or how the very trade that had led to his rejection would soon come hunting for him again, this time on land far better defended than the one he had lost. But as he settled into his new quarters that night, warmer and more comfortable than he had known in longer than he cared to remember, Elias allowed himself, cautiously, to hope that perhaps his exile had not been an ending after all, but the strange and unexpected beginning of something else entirely. Word of the strange tracks along the southern border traveled quickly through the Frostpack's inner circle, and within days, Elias found himself the subject of quiet conversation among the household staff and warriors alike. Some regarded him with continued suspicion, unable to shake the strangeness of his arrival. Others, seeing how Cade himself had begun consulting him on matters of border security, began to treat him with a cautious respect that Elias had not felt directed toward him in longer than he could remember. It was Fiona, the head of the kitchen staff, who first extended a genuine kindness toward him beyond simple duty. A stout, sharp-eyed woman with graying hair pulled back in a tight braid. She had initially eyed Elias with the same wariness as everyone else, but after watching him quietly help carry supplies for an entire afternoon without complaint, something in her manner softened. You work harder than most men born into this pack, she said one evening, setting a generous bowl of stew before him at the long kitchen table where the staff took their meals. Strange, for a man who arrived here as a stranger with nothing to prove. I have learned that proving myself is often the only way to earn a place anywhere, Elias said quietly, accepting the bowl with genuine gratitude. Fiona studied him a moment longer, then sat down across from him, lowering her voice slightly. The staff talk, you know, about how you were found, about how the king nearly ended you on the spot before the Luna intervened. Elias's shoulders tensed slightly at the reminder, though he did his best not to let it show. I imagine such a story would be difficult not to talk about.
Difficult, yes, Fiona agreed.
But I have also heard how you have helped along the border, how the king has begun seeking your counsel. Whatever brought you here, boy, it seems the moon had a reason for it. Elias managed a small, tired smile at that, though he did not fully believe in such notions of fate. He had spent too many years believing that hard work and honesty alone would protect him, only to discover how quickly both could be undone by lies told convincingly enough. But he appreciated the sentiment nonetheless, and the warmth of it lingered with him, long after Fiona had returned to her duties. It was Rhea, however, whose company he found himself seeking most in the days that followed, drawn by a curiosity and comfort he had not expected to find in the mate of the very Alpha King who had so nearly ended his life. She sought him out often during the quiet hours of the afternoon, when her own restlessness made sitting still in the great house unbearable, and their conversations gradually deepened beyond simple pleasantries into something closer to genuine friendship. You never speak of your family, Rhea observed one afternoon, as they sat together in the small garden behind the estate, sunlight filtering weakly through the winter clouds above them. Elias's expression grew shadowed at the question, and he was quiet for a long moment before answering. I have no family left to speak of. My parents were lost to a border skirmish when I was young. I was raised by the pack itself, passed between families who had room enough to take in another mouth to feed. That sounds lonely, Rhea said softly, genuine sympathy coloring her voice. It was, Elias admitted, though I learned early not to expect much from anyone, and so the loneliness became simply a fact of life rather than something to mourn. I suppose that made the rejection easier to bear, in a strange way. I had already learned how to survive without belonging to anyone. Rhea reached out, resting a hand briefly on his arm, a small gesture of comfort that caught him entirely off guard. You belong to something here now, whether you intended it or not. Cade may not admit it easily, but you have earned a place within this pack these past days, however cautious he remains. I am grateful for whatever place I have found, Elias said quietly. More grateful than I know how to properly express. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Owen, one of the younger warriors assigned to patrol duty, who approached with a message for Rhea from the healer, requesting her presence for a routine check on the pups. Rhea rose carefully, waving off Elias's offer to help her stand, though she smiled warmly as she did so. We will speak again soon, she said, before following Owen back toward the main house. Left alone in the garden, Elias found himself reflecting on how quickly his understanding of the Frost Pack had shifted from the wariness of a captive to something approaching genuine belonging. He had not expected kindness here, had braced himself instead for continued suspicion and confinement. Instead, he found himself slowly woven into the daily rhythms of a household that, despite its wealth and power, seemed built on a foundation of loyalty and care that his own former pack had entirely lacked. Yet even as this cautious sense of belonging grew within him, a quieter unease lingered beneath the surface. He thought often of the Ashwood pack, of the trade he had stumbled upon, of the disappearances he had tried to investigate before his own rejection silenced him. He knew, with a certainty that gnawed at him during the quiet hours of the night, that whoever had engineered his exile would not simply forget about him. Men who built profitable and illegal trades on the suffering of others rarely allowed loose threads to remain unresolved, and Elias understood himself to be exactly that kind of loose thread. He said nothing of this worry to Rhea, unwilling to burden her with fears that might prove baseless, or worse, might prove entirely justified and place her in danger, simply by association. But he began, quietly and without drawing attention, to pay closer attention to the comings and goings along the estate's borders, applying the same careful observation that had first earned Cade's grudging respect. It was during one of these quiet observations, several days later, that he noticed something that made his blood run cold. A rider, cloaked and moving with deliberate haste along the tree line at the edge of the estate's northern boundary, pausing only long enough to study the great house from a distance, before disappearing back into the forest. Elias recognized the cloak's distinctive pattern immediately, A weave used only by scouts of the Ashwood pack, the very pack that had cast him out only days before. They had found him. He stood frozen for a long moment, watching the empty tree line where the rider had vanished, his mind racing through the implications of what he had just witnessed. If the Ashwood pack knew where he was, it meant they considered him enough of a threat to track across unfamiliar and dangerous territory belonging to one of the most powerful alpha kings in the northern wilds. It meant the trade he had stumbled upon was significant enough that silencing him remained a priority even now, even here. He knew he needed to tell Cade immediately, understanding that whatever danger followed him now threatened not only his own safety, but potentially the safety of the entire Frost pack, including Rhea and the pups she carried so close to their time. As he turned to hurry back toward the main house, his mind already forming the words he would need to explain what he had seen, Elias felt the familiar weight of fear settle back over him, the same fear he had carried since the moment of his rejection. But beneath that fear, for the first time, he also felt something new. A fierce and unexpected determination to protect the fragile sense of belonging he had found here, whatever the cost might prove to be. Cade's study fell into a tense silence as Elias finished recounting what he had witnessed along the northern boundary. The cloaked rider studying the great house before vanishing back into the trees. The Alpha King had risen from his desk halfway through the account, his expression darkening with each detail Elias provided. "You are certain of the cloak," Cade said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Certain it belonged to the Ashwood pack." "I served alongside their scouts for years before my rejection," Elias said. "I would know that weave anywhere. They have found me, and I fear that means they consider whatever I know dangerous enough to pursue, even onto your land." Cade paced the length of his study, his jaw tight, his mind clearly working through the implications of what he had just heard. "This changes matters considerably. A rival pack testing my borders is one concern. A rival pack tracking a specific individual onto my land, an individual with knowledge of illegal trade, is an entirely different threat." "I understand if this changes your willingness to shelter me," Elias said quietly, bracing himself for the possibility that his newfound place within the pack might be stripped away as quickly as it had been granted. "I would not wish to bring danger to your household, especially not with the Luna so close to her time." Cade stopped his pacing abruptly, turning to fix Elias with a hard, searching look. "Do you take me for a coward, or a man who abandons those under his protection at the first sign of difficulty?" "No," Elias said quickly. "I only meant that I understand the risk I represent." "You represent knowledge," Cade corrected firmly. "Knowledge of a trade that may well be moving through territories close to my own. Knowledge that could protect my pack rather than endanger it, provided we use it wisely. The Ashwood pack tracking you onto my land is not a reason to cast you out. It is a reason to strengthen our defenses and prepare for whatever they intend." Elias felt a fresh wave of gratitude wash over him, though it was tempered by the seriousness of the situation unfolding before them. "What would you have me do?" "Tell me everything," Cade said, returning to his desk and gesturing for Elias to sit across from him once more. "Every detail you can recall about the trade you witnessed, every name, every location, every pattern of movement. If they are bold enough to track you here, then we must assume they believe you know something significant enough to warrant the risk." Over the following hour, Elias recounted every detail he could remember: the wagons that left under cover of darkness, the Omegas from smaller packs who vanished without explanation, the Beta who had grown suspiciously wealthy in recent years despite no obvious change in the pack's trade or resources. Cade listened intently, occasionally cross-referencing details against his own knowledge of the surrounding territories and their political alliances. "This sounds larger than a single pack's internal corruption," Cade said finally, once Elias had exhausted his recollection. "This sounds like a network, moving Omegas across multiple territories for reasons I do not yet understand, but which I suspect are far darker than simple greed." "I feared as much myself," Elias admitted, "though I never managed to uncover the full scope of it before I was silenced." Cade was quiet for a long moment, studying the map spread across his desk, tracing the borders of neighboring territories with one finger as he considered the implications. "I will send word to allied packs, quietly, to inquire whether similar disappearances have been noticed in their own territories. If this network extends as far as I suspect, we may not be the only ones capable of helping dismantle it." "That seems wise," Elias said, relief settling over him at the sense that Cade intended to act, rather than simply retreat from the danger. In the meantime, Cade continued, I will double the patrols along every border of this estate, particularly the northern boundary where you spotted the scout. And you, he added, fixing Elias with a firm look, will not wander the grounds alone until we better understand the scope of the threat against you. Elias nodded in agreement, understanding the necessity of the restriction, even as some part of him chafed slightly at the renewed limitation on his freedom. I will follow whatever precautions you consider necessary. Good, Cade said, then paused, studying Elias with an expression that had shifted subtly since their first encounter in the barn. I will admit, when I found you sleeping beside my mate, I believed I had discovered a threat to be dealt with swiftly. I did not expect to find, instead, a man whose knowledge might prove essential to protecting this pack from a danger I did not even know existed. I am simply grateful for the chance to prove myself useful, Elias said quietly. After everything that happened with my own pack, I did not expect to find purpose again so quickly. Cade studied him a moment longer, something unreadable passing behind his golden eyes, before he nodded once and returned his attention to the map before him. We will speak again once the patrols have been adjusted. For now, return to your quarters and rest. Tomorrow will require a clear head from both of us. Elias rose and made his way from the study, his mind still racing with the implications of the rider he had witnessed, the danger that had followed him even here, and the strange, unexpected trust that seemed to be growing between himself and the very Alpha King who had once held him by the collar, ready to end his life on the spot. As he walked through the quiet hallways of the great house, he passed the room where Rhea rested, and paused for a moment outside her door, listening to the soft sounds of movement within. He thought of the danger that had followed him onto this land, danger that could easily threaten her and the pups she carried, if the Ashwood pack grew bold enough to act, rather than simply watch from the tree line. He resolved, quietly and without informing anyone of his intention, that he would do everything within his power to ensure that danger never reached her. Whatever debt he owed the Frost Pack for their unexpected mercy, he intended to repay it in full, regardless of the cost to himself. The following days passed in a tense but productive blur, patrols doubling along every border, messages sent quietly to allied packs inquiring about similar disappearances, and Elias himself contributing what knowledge he could to strengthen the estate's defenses. Slowly, cautiously, the household began to shift its perception of him once more, no longer viewing him simply as a stranger to be watched, but as a valuable ally in a growing and dangerous situation. Even Callum, who had shown Elias nothing but cold suspicion in the early days of his confinement, began to soften slightly, exchanging brief nods of acknowledgement during the patrols they now shared responsibility for coordinating. It was a small thing, perhaps, but to Elias, who had known only rejection and suspicion for so long, even these small gestures of acceptance felt like precious gifts. Yet beneath the growing sense of purpose and belonging, the danger along the northern boundary remained unresolved, a threat that continued to loom over the estate like a shadow waiting to fall. And none of them, not Cade, not Rhea, and certainly not Elias himself, could yet know just how soon that shadow would finally make its move. The weeks that followed brought a strange and fragile peace to the Frostpack's estate, though beneath its surface, tension continued to simmer quietly among those who understood the full scope of the danger gathering along the northern boundary. Elias, granted greater freedom now that his knowledge had proven valuable, found himself spending increasing amounts of time in Rhea's company, their friendship deepening in ways that neither of them had quite anticipated. They walked together often through the estate's gardens during the milder afternoons, Rhea's steps growing slower and more careful as her time drew nearer, and Elias adjusting his own pace patiently to match hers, without ever making the accommodation feel like a burden. Their conversations ranged widely, from simple observations about the changing seasons to deeper reflections on loss, belonging, and the strange twists of fate that had brought them together. You have a gentleness about you, Rhea observed one afternoon, as they paused beside a small pond near the edge of the garden, that seems entirely at odds with everything you must have endured. I would have expected bitterness, anger, after everything your pack put you through. I felt both of those things, Elias admitted, watching the ripples spread across the pond's still surface. For a time, I felt little else, but anger consumes a great deal of energy, and I found I had little left to spare, after walking through that first night alone in the cold. I suppose gentleness simply became easier to hold on to than rage. Rhea studied him with an expression that held something warmer than simple curiosity, something Elias found himself increasingly reluctant to examine too closely, aware as he was of the impropriety such feelings would represent toward the mate of the very king who had shown him mercy. Cade, for his part, had noticed the growing closeness between his mate and the stranger he had once nearly ended, and found himself wrestling with emotions he did not entirely understand. Gratitude toward Elias for the knowledge and assistance he had provided sat uneasily, alongside a possessive unease that flared whenever he observed the easy warmth between Rhea and their unexpected guest. He found himself watching them more closely than he intended, standing at the window of his study on more than one occasion, observing their slow walks through the garden with an expression he could not quite name. He told himself it was simple vigilance, the natural caution of an alpha king protecting his mate from any potential threat, but some quieter, more honest part of him recognized the feeling for what it truly was, a jealousy he had no right to feel toward a man who had done nothing but help and protect his family since the day of his arrival. "You watch him closely," Rhea observed one evening, catching Cade's gaze lingering on the window where Elias could be seen crossing the courtyard below. "I watch everyone closely," Cade replied, though the deflection sounded weak even to his own ears. Rhea's expression softened, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Cade, he has done nothing but help this pack since the day you found him. You do not need to feel threatened by his presence." "I do not feel threatened," Cade said, though the sharpness in his voice suggested otherwise. "I feel cautious. There is a difference." "Is there?" Rhea asked gently. "Or are you simply unwilling to admit that you have grown to value him, and that admission frightens you more than any threat he might pose?" Cade said nothing for a long moment, his jaw tight as he considered her words. He had built his entire reign on careful control, on never allowing emotion to cloud his judgment or weaken his authority. The confusion Elias's presence had stirred within him, gratitude tangled with jealousy, respect tangled with unease, was not a feeling he knew how to manage gracefully. "Whatever I feel," he said finally, "does not change the danger that continues to gather along our northern border. That remains my priority, and it should remain yours as well." Rhea did not push the matter further, though the quiet knowing look she gave him suggested she understood far more than he wished to admit. She returned to her own thoughts, resting a hand over her belly as the pups within shifted restlessly, and allowed the conversation to settle into silence. Meanwhile, further south, in the shadowed halls of the Ashwood Pack's territory, a different kind of tension had begun to build. Dorian, the beta who had orchestrated Elias's rejection, paced the length of his private quarters with growing agitation, having just received word from the scout he had sent north to confirm the rumors of Elias's whereabouts. "He is under the Frost King's protection," the scout reported, keeping his eyes carefully lowered as he delivered the unwelcome news. "Sheltered within the estate itself, and from what I could observe, he appears to be assisting with border security." Dorian's expression darkened considerably at this revelation. He had assumed, when he orchestrated Elias's rejection, that the Omega would simply vanish into the wilderness, unable to survive long without pack protection, and that his knowledge of the trade would die with him somewhere in the frozen wilds. The possibility that Elias had instead found shelter with one of the most powerful alpha kings in the region, and worse, had begun actively assisting in strengthening that king's defenses, represented a complication he had not anticipated. "He knows too much to be allowed such protection," Dorian said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "If he speaks further of what he witnessed, if the Frost King begins investigating our trade routes in earnest, everything we have built could unravel." "What would you have us do?" the scout asked carefully. "The Frost Pack's defenses are formidable. A direct confrontation would be costly, and likely unsuccessful." Dorian was quiet for a long moment, his mind working through the possibilities with the same cold calculation that had allowed him to orchestrate Elias's rejection so cleanly in the first place. "We do not need a direct confrontation," he said finally. "We need only an opportunity. The Frost King's mate is close to her time, is she not?" "Very close, from what I observed," the scout confirmed, uncertainty creeping into his voice as he sensed the direction of his beta's thoughts. "Then we wait," Dorian said, a cold smile spreading across his face. "We wait for the moment when the Frost King's attention is most divided, when his defenses are most likely to be distracted by matters closer to home. And when that moment comes, we act, swiftly and decisively, to remove the threat Elias represents once and for all. The scout said nothing further, though a flicker of unease crossed his features at the ruthlessness of the plan being outlined. He had followed Dorian loyally for years, believing in the strength and wisdom of his leadership, but something about this particular scheme, targeting a pregnant Luna's most vulnerable moment to settle a score against a single exiled Omega, sat uneasily, even with his own conscience. He said nothing, however, understanding that questioning his beta's judgment would only invite the same suspicion and rejection that had befallen Elias in the first place. Instead, he bowed his head in silent acknowledgement and turned to begin preparing for whatever role Dorian intended for him in the plan now taking shape. Back at the Frostpack's estate, unaware of the danger being carefully planned against them, Elias and Rhea continued their quiet friendship, and Cade continued to wrestle privately with feelings he did not yet know how to name. None of them could have guessed how quickly the fragile peace they had built would soon be shattered, or how close the coming storm truly was. The message arrived from an allied pack to the east, 3 weeks after Cade had first sent out his quiet inquiries, and its contents confirmed every fear Elias had carried since his rejection began. The pack reported not one, but 4 separate disappearances of young Omegas over the past year, each dismissed at the time as unfortunate wandering or accident, but which now, in light of the pattern Elias had described, appeared to be something far more deliberate. Cade summoned Elias to his study immediately upon receiving the message, spreading the letter across his desk with a grim expression. "It is as we feared," he said, once Elias had read through the account himself. "This is not confined to your former pack alone. Whatever network is responsible for this trade extends across multiple territories." "Then Dorian is not acting alone," Elias said quietly, his stomach turning at the confirmation of suspicions he had carried for months. "He is part of something larger, something with reach far beyond a single pack's borders." "It would explain how he was able to construct such a convincing case against you," Cade said. "A network with resources and influence spanning multiple territories would have little difficulty fabricating evidence sufficient to secure your rejection." Elias sank into the chair across from Cade's desk, the weight of the revelation settling heavily over him. "If that is true, then my knowledge alone will not be enough to stop them. Dorian is merely one piece of something much larger." "Perhaps," Cade agreed, "but he is the piece closest to us, and the piece most directly connected to the danger currently following you onto my land. If we can expose his involvement, and sever his connection to whatever network he answers to, we may yet cripple the operation significantly, even if we cannot dismantle it entirely." Their discussion was interrupted by a soft knock at the study door, and Rhea entered slowly, one hand pressed against the small of her back, her expression tight with discomfort that had nothing to do with the conversation unfolding before her. "Cade," she said, her voice carrying a note of urgency that immediately drew both men's attention. "I do not feel well," the healer said. "My time was still weeks away, but something feels different tonight." Cade rose immediately, crossing the room to her side with an expression of pure concern, replacing the grim determination he had worn moments before. "Different how?" "I do not know," Rhea admitted, wincing slightly as a fresh wave of discomfort passed through her. "Perhaps it is nothing, but I wanted you to know." "I will send for the healer immediately," Cade said, already moving toward the door, though his eyes lingered on Rhea with unmistakable worry. As Cade hurried from the room to summon aid, Elias rose to help Rhea settle into a chair, his own concern mounting as he watched the discomfort crease her features more deeply. "Can I bring you anything?" he asked gently. "Water, perhaps, or something warm?" "Just stay with me a moment," Rhea said, gripping his arm with more strength than he expected. "Until Cade returns." Elias remained beside her, offering what quiet comfort he could, though his mind raced with worry over what her sudden discomfort might signify. If her time truly had come early, the household would need to move quickly to ensure both her safety and the safety of the pups she carried. It was in this moment of distraction, with the household's attention drawn entirely toward Rhea's condition, that Dorian's carefully planned opportunity finally arrived. Outside the estate's walls, hidden within the tree line along the northern boundary, a small group of Ashwood warriors had been watching and waiting for exactly this kind of moment. A moment when the Frost Pack's attention would be divided, and their defenses momentarily less vigilant. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a distant howl, a signal call that immediately drew Callum's attention from his post, near the estate's main gate. He recognized the pattern instantly as a warning of intrusion, and sounded the alarm across the grounds, drawing warriors from every corner of the estate toward the northern boundary where the breach had occurred. Cade, halfway to summoning the healer, froze at the sound of the alarm, torn between his duty to protect his pack and his desperate need to remain at Rhea's side during what might be the beginning of her labor. "Go," Rhea said firmly, understanding the conflict written across his face, even through her own discomfort. "Elias will stay with me. Your pack needs you at the border." Cade hesitated only a moment longer before nodding sharply, casting one final look of fierce concern toward Rhea, before sprinting toward the sound of the alarm, gathering warriors as he went. Elias remained at Rhea's side, his own heart pounding, with a mixture of fear for her safety and fear for what the intrusion at the border might signify. He suspected, with a grim certainty that settled cold in his stomach, exactly who had chosen this precise moment to strike. "They have come for me," he said quietly, more to himself than to Rhea, though she caught the words and turned to look at him with sharp understanding. "The Ashwood pack," she said, her discomfort momentarily forgotten in the face of this new realization. "They must have been watching, waiting for exactly this kind of distraction," Elias said, his mind racing through the implications. "If they breach the northern boundary while the household's attention is divided, they could reach the estate itself before Cade's warriors can properly organize a defense." "Then you must go," Rhea said firmly, gripping his arm. "Help him. I will be fine here with the healer." "I will not leave you unprotected," Elias said firmly, surprising himself with the fierce determination in his own voice. "If they have truly come for me, then remaining close to you may be exactly what places you in greater danger. I need to draw them away from the house, away from you and the pups." Rhea's eyes widened with understanding and alarm. "Elias, that is far too dangerous. You do not know how many warriors they have brought." "It does not matter how many," Elias said, already moving toward the door, his earlier fear transformed into something harder and more determined. "I will not allow the danger that followed me here to harm you or your family. This is my responsibility to resolve, and I intend to see it through." Before Rhea could protest further, Elias had already slipped from the room, moving with purpose toward the sounds of chaos gathering near the northern boundary, his heart pounding with a fear he refused to let slow his steps. Whatever the coming confrontation held, he understood with absolute clarity that he could not stand aside and allow the family that had shown him unexpected mercy to suffer for his own past mistakes. The night ahead promised danger unlike anything he had faced since the moment of his rejection, but for the first time since that terrible day, Elias moved forward, not with the aimless desperation of a man with nothing left to lose, but with the fierce and steady purpose of a man determined to protect something worth protecting. The northern boundary had erupted into chaos by the time Elias arrived, warriors of the Frost Pack clashing with the intruders in the pale moonlight, the sounds of the confrontation echoing across the frozen fields. Elias scanned the chaos quickly, searching for any sign of Dorian among the attacking warriors. His suspicion confirmed the moment he spotted the familiar figure standing at the edge of the tree line, directing his warriors with cold precision. "Dorian," Elias called out, his voice carrying clearly across the din of the confrontation. The former beta turned at the sound of his name, a slow, cruel smile spreading across his face, as he recognized the man standing before him. "There you are," Dorian said, stepping forward with the confidence of a predator who believed he had finally cornered his prey. "I had wondered how long it would take for you to show yourself, once we drew enough attention toward this border." "You used this moment deliberately," Elias said, understanding fully now the calculation behind the timing of the attack. "You waited for the Luna's condition to draw attention away from the boundary." "A convenient distraction," Dorian agreed, his smile widening. "Though I admit, I had not expected you to walk directly into our hands quite so easily. Perhaps some part of you still carries the same foolish loyalty that led to your downfall in the first place." "This is not loyalty," Elias said, squaring his shoulders despite the fear coiling tight in his chest. "This is simply refusing to let you harm people who have shown me more kindness in a few weeks than my own pack showed me in years." Dorian's expression hardened at the words, any pretense of civility dropping away entirely. Kindness will not save you tonight. You know too much, and the network I answer to cannot afford to let that knowledge spread any further. This ends here." He gave a sharp signal, and several of his warriors broke away from the main confrontation, converging on Elias with clear intent. Elias braced himself, drawing on training he had not used in years, training from a childhood spent learning to defend contested borders long before his rejection had ever seemed possible. The confrontation that followed was brutal and swift. Elias, fighting with a desperate determination, born not of skill alone, but of absolute resolve to protect what he had found here. He managed to hold his ground against the first two warriors who reached him, years of dormant training resurfacing just in time to keep him standing, though he took several hard strikes that left him bruised and breathless. It was Cade who arrived, just as a third warrior closed in, cutting the man down with a swift and decisive strike, before turning to survey the chaos around him, his golden eyes finding Elias immediately. "You should not have come here alone," Cade said, positioning himself protectively beside him, even as more of Dorian's warriors converged on their location. "I could not let them reach the house," Elias said, breathing hard, blood trickling from a cut along his brow. "Not with Rhea so close to her time." Cade's expression flickered with something complicated. Gratitude and concern tangled together, before the immediate danger forced his focus back to the confrontation surrounding them. Together, they fought back against the wave of attackers, Cade's raw strength complementing Elias's careful, trained precision, in a combination that gradually began turning the tide of the confrontation in their favor. Dorian, watching from the tree line as his warriors fell one by one against the combined defense of the Frost King and the Omega he had once cast aside, felt his earlier confidence curdling into something closer to panic. He had not anticipated Elias fighting back with such determination, nor had he anticipated the swift and decisive response of Cade's warriors, who now poured toward the northern boundary, in numbers far greater than his own small strike force could withstand. "Fall back," Dorian finally ordered, his voice tight with barely controlled fury, as he watched his plan crumble before his eyes. "This was a mistake, we withdraw." But before his remaining warriors could retreat fully into the tree line, a fresh commotion erupted from the direction of the main house, a runner arriving breathless and urgent, calling out for Cade across the chaos of the battlefield. "My king," the runner gasped, "the Luna. Her time has come. The healer says the pups are coming now." Cade's entire expression transformed at the news, fierce battle focus giving way instantly to raw paternal urgency. He turned to Elias, torn between the need to see the confrontation through and the desperate pull to return to Rhea's side. "Go," Elias said immediately, understanding the conflict without needing further explanation. "Your warriors have this well in hand. Dorian is already retreating. Go to her." Cade hesitated only a moment before nodding sharply, calling out orders to his remaining warriors to finish securing the boundary, and ensure Dorian's forces did not attempt a second approach, before sprinting back toward the main house with a speed born of pure urgency. Elias remained behind just long enough to ensure the confrontation had truly turned in the Frostpack's favor, watching as Dorian's retreating warriors vanished back into the tree line, their plan thoroughly unraveled by the combined resistance they had encountered. Only once he was certain the immediate danger had passed did he allow himself to follow after Cade, his body aching from the confrontation, but his heart lighter than it had been and longer than he could remember. He arrived at the main house to find the household in a state of controlled chaos, staff moving briskly between rooms carrying supplies, the healer's low, steady voice issuing calm instructions from behind the closed door of Rhea's chamber. Elias remained in the hallway outside, uncertain of his place in such an intimate moment, though he found himself unable to leave entirely, some deep instinct urging him to remain close until he knew both Rhea and the pups were safe. The hours that followed stretched long and tense, the sounds from within the chamber shifting between moments of quiet murmuring and sharper, more urgent exchanges between the healer and her assistants. Elias paced the hallway, his earlier injuries forgotten in the face of this new anxiety, until finally, as the first light of dawn began creeping through the windows of the great house, a new sound broke through the tension, the thin, healthy cry of newborn pups. The chamber door opened moments later, and Cade emerged, his expression transformed entirely from the fierce warrior who had fought beside Elias only hours before. Exhaustion and overwhelming relief mingled openly across his features, and when his eyes found Elias waiting in the hallway, Something in his gaze softened in a way Elias had never seen before. "They are well," Cade said, his voice thick with an emotion he made no attempt to hide. "Rhea and the pups, both well. The healer says the early arrival was simply nature's own timing, nothing more sinister." "I am glad," Elias said quietly, genuine relief flooding through him. "Truly glad." Cade studied him for a long moment, taking in the bruises and the cut along his brow, the evidence of the fight he had thrown himself into, without hesitation to protect a family that, mere weeks before, had considered him nothing more than a dangerous stranger. "You fought for us tonight," Cade said slowly. "You could have run. You could have let my warriors handle Dorian's attack alone and remained safely hidden within the house. Instead, you went directly toward the danger, knowing it was your own past that had brought it to our door. I could not stand by while people I have come to care for faced danger, because of choices I made long before I ever arrived here," Elias said simply. Cade was quiet for a long moment, something shifting visibly behind his golden eyes, before he finally spoke again, his voice carrying a weight and sincerity that Elias had not heard from him before. "I believe, Elias, that I owe you a debt far greater than simple gratitude, and I believe it is time this pack acknowledged exactly what you have earned here, through knowledge, through loyalty, and now, through blood spilled in our defense." Word of Dorian's failed attack spread quickly through the surrounding territories in the days that followed, carried by messengers to every allied pack that had responded to Cade's earlier inquiries about the disappearing Omegas. What had once been scattered rumors and isolated incidents now coalesced into an undeniable pattern, and with Elias's detailed testimony about the trade routes, the wagons, and the network of packs involved, a coalition of Alpha Kings began the slow, deliberate process of dismantling the operation that had caused so much suffering. The Ashwood Pack, exposed and isolated once its allies realized the extent of Dorian's illegal dealings, found itself abandoned by the very network it had served. Within weeks, Dorian was stripped of his position by his own remaining pack elders, unwilling to continue association with a beta whose greed had brought the attention of multiple powerful Alpha Kings down upon their territory. He fled south, pursued by warriors from 3 different packs seeking justice for the Omegas his trade had harmed, and Elias, upon hearing the news, felt a complicated mixture of relief and quiet sorrow that it had taken so much suffering to finally expose a truth he had recognized so long ago. But within the walls of the Frostpack's estate, the atmosphere had transformed entirely from the wary suspicion that had greeted Elias's arrival weeks before. Rhea recovered quickly from the early arrival of her pups, 2 healthy pups, a boy and a girl, who filled the great house with new energy and warmth that seemed to soften even the estate's oldest and most weathered corners. Elias found himself welcomed into this new chapter of the household's life in ways he had never dared to imagine possible. Fiona insisted he take his meals no longer at the staff table, but alongside the family itself. Callum, who had once watched him with cold suspicion, now greeted him each morning with genuine warmth, occasionally even seeking his counsel on matters of border patrol given the respect Elias had earned through his knowledge and his willingness to fight when it mattered most. It was Cade, however, whose transformation surprised Elias most deeply. The Alpha King, who had once held him by the collar ready to end his life without hesitation, now sought his company with a regularity that spoke of something far beyond simple gratitude. They spent long evenings together in the study, discussing matters of pack governance, border security, and the slow, careful work of rebuilding trust, with neighboring territories still recovering from the exposed trade network. "I have decided," Cade said one evening, as they sat together before the low fire in his study, the warmth of the flames casting long shadows across the room, "that a debt as significant as the one I owe you cannot simply be repaid with continued shelter and grudging trust." Elias looked up from the papers he had been reviewing, uncertain of where this conversation was heading. "You owe me nothing more than what you have already given me. A home, when I had none. Purpose, when I believed I had lost it entirely." "That may be true from your perspective," Cade said, "but from mine, you arrived on this land a stranger with nothing, and within a matter of weeks, you helped expose a trade network that had harmed Omegas across multiple territories. You fought and bled, defending my family, when danger came directly to our door, and you did all of this, while I offered you nothing but suspicion in return." "You offered me mercy," Elias corrected gently. "That is no small thing, coming from an alpha king who found a stranger sleeping beside his expecting mate. Cade's expression softened slightly at the memory, a ghost of a smile touching his features. Perhaps not. But mercy alone is not enough. I intend to grant you a formal place within this pack, Elias, not as a guest under careful watch, but as a protector of this household, with rank and standing equal to any warrior who has served this pack their entire life. Elias's breath caught in his throat at the offer, the weight of it settling over him with an emotion he struggled to name. After the humiliation of his rejection, after weeks of believing himself unworthy of belonging anywhere, the idea of being formally welcomed into a pack as powerful and respected as the Frost Pack felt almost too significant to fully comprehend. I do not know what to say, he admitted quietly. Say only that you accept, Cade said. This pack owes you a debt of loyalty, and I intend to see it honored properly. The ceremony that followed a few days later was small but significant, held within the great hall of the estate, before the assembled warriors and staff of the Frost Pack. Elias stood before Cade, his heart pounding, with an emotion far removed from the fear that had once defined his every interaction with the Alpha King, as Cade formally declared him a protector of the pack, bound not by blood, but by loyalty, earned through knowledge, courage, and sacrifice. Rhea watched from nearby, one pup cradled gently in her arms, her expression radiant with quiet joy as she witnessed the moment. When the ceremony concluded, and the assembled pack offered their formal acknowledgement of Elias's new standing, she approached him with a warm smile, gently placing her free hand on his arm. You have found your place, she said softly, just as I always believed you would. I owe that to your faith in me, Elias said, his voice thick with emotion. From the very first morning in the barn, when you convinced Cade to spare my life, you gave me a chance I never expected to receive. And you have more than repaid that faith, Rhea said warmly, before glancing meaningfully toward where Cade stood, watching them both, his expression carrying a warmth and openness that had not been present during those first tense days of Elias's arrival. Later that evening, as the celebration settled into quieter conversation among the household, Cade found Elias standing alone near the edge of the great hall, watching the warm scene before him with quiet contentment. You seem thoughtful, Cade observed, coming to stand beside him. I am simply grateful, Elias said. A month ago, I was rejected by everyone I had ever known, walking alone through the wilderness with no destination and no hope. Now I stand here, welcomed into a pack I never expected to find, granted a place I never believed I would earn. Cade was quiet for a moment, studying him with an expression that had grown increasingly difficult for Elias to read in recent weeks, something warmer and more complicated than simple gratitude or respect. Fate has strange ways of finding the right path, even when the beginning seems entirely without purpose, Cade said finally. I did not expect, when I found you sleeping in that barn, that you would become someone this pack, and perhaps someone in it personally, would come to value so deeply. Elias felt his pulse quicken slightly at the weight behind Cade's words, uncertain of exactly what the Alpha King meant to convey, though something in his chest stirred with a cautious, hopeful curiosity he did not yet dare to name. Whatever this pack has come to feel toward me, Elias said carefully, I intend to spend the rest of my days proving myself worthy of it. Cade studied him a moment longer, something decided and warm settling behind his golden eyes, before he offered a small, genuine smile, the first Elias had ever seen cross his features so freely. I believe you already have, he said quietly. As the celebration continued around them, the warmth of the great hall spilling out into the cold winter night beyond, Elias allowed himself, finally and fully, to believe that the barn where he had once collapsed in exhausted desperation had not marked the end of his story, but the true and unexpected beginning of it. Whatever the future held, whatever quiet and complicated feelings continued to grow between himself and the family that had shown him such unexpected mercy, he understood now that he was no longer walking alone through an unforgiving world. He had found, against every possible expectation, a place to belong,